right, I have a question for you. How many people have met somebody new already this morning? Yes. That's good. That wasn't everyone, though. Day's not, by the end, I'll ask you to hold up how many new people you've met. All right, why do I say that? One of the key, when we think, guys, when we think about INSEAD having impact, one of the key pillars is you, the INSEAD alumni community, and the connections amongst us, right? That's what it's all about. Another key pillar, though, of INSEAD is our faculty. And our next speaker, my dear colleague, Jazit, a great example, right? Well, you know this institution of tenure, right? So I think Jazit is a great example of the power of that. At INSEAD, he worked his ass off, learning to teach people like you, some of the most difficult MBA, EMBA people to teach ever, and he proved that he could do cutting-edge academic research in terms of really probing innovation processes using huge data sets of, patent stuff. And then he gets tenure, and like many of the leaders we hear today, he stepped back and said, okay, wow, I've been given lifetime employment at INSEAD. What am I going to do with that gift? And since then, he has committed himself as a scholar, as a teacher, to really understanding and teaching about social impact. Please join me in welcoming Jazit Singh. Jazit.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. A little bit humbling that, a lot of the very inspiring people spoke for 15 minutes, and I get 60 minutes. It's also, I was told why I got 60 minutes. It turns out that the better the talks, the shorter they are. So they felt that I really wouldn't be able to get my point across in 15 minutes, so I have a little bit more time to, fumble and do the things that we do. Before I start, and going back to the point that Andre said, there's something about the apology, there's something about the joke. I'll try combining those two into a skit, right? So everybody has to be creative. Creativity is what we're talking about. So, the colleagues from the Alumni Forum, they came to me and they said, okay, I'll act it out. Jasjit, we have this Alumni Forum happening in Geneva. Would you like to come? Alumni Forum, what's that? And why do professors go there? Well, that's where we turn professors into rock stars. I can handle that. What do I have to do? Give a talk. We know your laptop has about 2,000 PowerPoint slides, but really, can you cut it down to something meaningful that you can say coherently in 1 hour? Well, I am about social impact after all. Can I give a talk that says something like maybe thinking about impact? He says, well, the topic seems interesting. It's not sexy enough. Well, how about I say thinking strategically about impact? Because you do know that all the MBA electives that are popular in INSEAD, there's a strategic pricing, strategic supply chain, strategic marketing, strategic procurement. So, hey, why not? So that worked out okay. But I'm not done yet. I have an hour, so my skit can be longer, right? So the other thing that they said was, but there is this thing, we don't know how to say this, but you really, I know you're a professor on the Singapore campus, but this is in Geneva. It's a very respectable place. You can't be wearing shorts and flip-flops there. So I said, really? Okay, so what's the dress code there? Well, business casual. I say, I can do that. I'll wear shoes. And then I come here. I see all these people in suits and ties. I don't think they'll let me in the dinner this evening. There's not a chance. Black tie. And then there's this last part there was, and I think this is where we can switch to the slides. Oh, the slides are ready already. I've been depressed sitting in my office, working very hard, and every now and then looking at my Twitter following, and it was like 541. So that's pretty depressing for an INSEAD full professor. So I asked the alumni forum people, can you do something about it? So here's an idea. Why don't you put your hand out in advance on your Twitter account and don't put it anywhere else? So if any of you would like to access the handout, it's already there. The Twitter is sjasjeet. Got it? Let's get started. So I'm Jasjeet Singh. Finally, I should introduce myself. I've been here for 15 years. It's a real pleasure. I'm going to jump straight in, and I'm going to ask you a question that I want you to really answer honestly. All things considered, in your honest opinion, I'd like to know, do you consider the net impact business schools, which includes INSEAD, but not just, think business schools, top 10, top 20 in general, the impact that we have on society is significantly positive, close to neutral, significantly negative. How many of you think it's significantly positive? How many of you think it's close to neutral? How many of you think it's significantly negative? So it's interesting that even within this room, about 10% of the people think that the impact business schools as a whole have is significantly negative. Of course, they have in mind the other business schools, right? If I had asked about the INSEAD, that would have been different. But the reality we have to keep in mind is this is how the world views us. And the story of business schools, of course, is intertwined with the story of business in general. And it's all fine for us to congratulate each other with business as a force for good and how we're changing the world. But I think we should start with a position of humility that this is not how the world views us, and we really have a long way to go. Okay, so the other thing, so I'm not used to this TED style. I mean, there was my slide here, and then I looked here, and that was me there. So I have to, okay, so that one is there. So I have to be a little bit careful. So, there is, in fact, this argument that not only are businesses responsible for, a lot of environmental damage, a lot of inequality, and all of that. On top of that, we, the elites, most of us are probably in the top 0.1% of the global population, perhaps 0.01%. I haven't looked very carefully. But we, the elites, not only first are responsible for capturing all the value, but then we pretend that we are going to fix the world, right? And we saw some of the conversations to be successful in life. What is important? Yeah, skills sort of matter. Networks matter a lot. You can see why some people would have a problem with that thing that we would like to see positively, and we have to be a little bit careful. The other thing, of course, that we have to bear in mind is we really should think of business as a complement for the social sector, the business sector, the development sector, and so on. We are not going to solve all of the world's problems just by creating shared value and doing well by doing good. Sometimes it takes compromises. Certain kind of compromises we might make. Yes, through creativity, we can get over a lot of compromises. But in other positions, there are real compromises, and we should not come in the way of social sector and government sector when looking at those issues. If anything, we should be collaborating with them and solving the big problems. And we saw the Gavi as an excellent example of that happening. The other thing to bear in mind, of course, is the next generation. Even our own kids don't view us particularly positively. And to be honest, that was one of the reasons of switching into social impact, because my kids really couldn't care less about what I was doing with my life before that. It's like, okay, well, maybe yours did. And that has helped me. For me, I've gone through a journey. Maybe you were a great person, born a great person. I'm still work in progress, and I'm transforming. And for me, one of the big things that inspires me in the classroom is when the MBA students themselves are saying, what are we doing for the society? What is business doing for the society? This is not a conversation I am imposing on the students. I have 200 students signed up in my electives, and they themselves are asking, what is our mission? What is our purpose? Where are we going from them? And that's important things that we certainly need to bear in mind as we go through all of this. So this is, the context we have to be aware of. But the other thing, of course, is all of us, we are very often the thing that's not visible from the outside is that even on the inside, we actually want to contribute, right? That's the reality. Most of us do. Human beings are complex entities which have multiple motivations, and we sometimes feel that are we stuck in a system where it's not what we would like to necessarily do. And sometimes we are doing things that we say, okay, this is my day job, and what I do really to contribute to the world is what happens in the evening and the weekends, right? So we say, okay, we don't want to feel that during the day we are leaving our values at the door when we go to work, and what happens to us at work is something that's just a 9 to 5 thing, and the way I contribute to society is what happens after hours and on the weekends. So, the question is, how do you make a difference? Some people end up taking extreme steps. And Tishan talked yesterday about Room to Read, right? So there's this story of John Wood, who started Room to Read. He was an MBA from Kellogg, and as somebody mentioned yesterday, nobody's perfect. But he was heading business development at Microsoft in Greater China. And then he shows up in Nepal one day. He comes face to face with poverty. He sees schools that have no books, and he decides to make it his life's mission to bring books to rural Nepal and ultimately globally. So by now they've opened like 20,000 libraries and so on. But the journey has not been easy. Even for him, it has been a journey of discovery, of realizing that it's not English language books about Thanksgiving turkey that are going to bring literacy to places like Nepal. Room to Read over the last 10 years has evolved immensely, as Tishan was talking about, deliberately starting to look at what is the impact, what are the outcomes that are achieving, what is it that gets kids to learn. That involves working with policymakers. It doesn't involve me imposing what I think is the right education for this place, but working with local ecosystems and all of that. Right, so that's one model. That's fine, there's a place for that, and there's a few people even in this room that are doing that. But as business school people and as business people, that might not be the most natural trajectory for us. Not to mention that for every one successful John Wood, there are perhaps many that are not getting even close to what he's achieving. And we have to bear in mind, where can we contribute? So the other direction that a lot of us then take is saying, well, how about corporate social responsibility? Practically, a lot of times the CSR projects then end up working is saying, okay, once a year, if it's done through companies, or maybe you're doing it individually, over a weekend, over a week, this is rural Cambodia, I'm going to go and build houses for poor people there. So typically the way these programs work is either the company or the individual would give, let's say, 800 euros, 1,000 euros to go there, first of all, and then to help build. Now, the reality is, when you put an INSEAD professor in a construction project in Cambodia, he's not going to do particularly well. Chances are they're going to get somebody the next day, pay that person to undo all the damage that I did. They have paid for my insurance, and surely, I couldn't drink tap water, especially rural Cambodia. I mean, come on, that would just increase Gabby's budget. Or somebody would have to pay for, me getting sick there. So they have to arrange for mineral water, they have to arrange for insurance, and then there's this additional insurance that if something happens to me, like, I hit my fingers with a hammer, then there will be a helicopter that flies you out. There's this SOS insurance that we always buy when we go. So yes, what's the net value? Chances are out of those 800 euros, about 200, 300 euros are going towards that. And thank goodness about 500 euros is left behind to actually help those people. Now, I'm not saying these are bad projects, but these are not necessarily the projects through which we are changing the world, especially as business people. There's a lot of other value to there. It's connecting us with the world, right? It's making us aware of the issues in the world. And this trip I made with my younger son, so he learned about Cambodia, he learned about poverty, he came back all pumped up that I want to do something in life that will, help make the world a better place. He made some new friends, it's a great team building thing, but let's call what it is. This is not our best way to change the world recipe, right? And we should acknowledge it. So what really is impact? I mean, I like to use this very simple, almost deceptively simple formula, which actually is something I'd borrowed from the core strategy from Peter Zemsky 15 years ago. There was this reading from Adam Brandenburger that we used to use. I don't know if it's still assigned or if there's anything better than that. And instead of calling it your impact, we used to call it unique value creation, because the way you create unique value is you just say you're bringing something to the value creation. Remember the gap between willingness to pay and cost to deliver, and how you maximize all of that. And competitive advantage was always starting from a position of creating unique value. Really, that's what impact is. Impact is how do you create unique value, except that you're bearing in mind not the value created just for you and the customer in that transaction, but you're bearing in mind all the implications of what you're doing to what's happening in the world. So impact really is about unique value, but you're considering all aspects of value rather than just those relevant for your direct transaction. So, to make this a little bit more concrete, I was reading this study of somebody did in the 90s of people jumping out of planes. In two of these skydiving centers in the UK, people say, okay, I want to raise money for charity, I want to get somebody to sponsor me. Well, nobody's going to give money for charity unless I have a nice story. So the story I'll give to my friends and family is, hey, look, for this charity, I'm going to jump out of the plane. Wouldn't you want to give me some money to sponsor that? That's great. That's a noble endeavor. These are first-time people who would not have jumped otherwise, and they're collecting a lot of their guts to do this. So 1,500 people over that 5-year period that they studied had raised for charity 120,000 pounds. That's great. Well, so the first catch was the price of the dives had to be covered by that, right? Great. So we take that out, you're still left with 45,000 pounds. Isn't it still good for the world? Okay, so let's see. Could there be any unintended consequences? Well, in the 90s, jumping out of planes was not a very safe activity, and these were first-time people jumping out. So the National Health System in the UK covered 610,000 pounds. So for every pound that's being raised, society is bearing the cost of 10 pounds, while these people are feeling wonderfully happy how they've changed the world. And this really is not how we want to change the world. That's a starting point to be aware of when we go there. Okay, so there's three critical questions come up from this perhaps overly simplistic example, but I think the points are much more general and super important. The first is, what are we achieving? It's not about what are our intentions. It is not about what are we doing. The question is, what are we achieving? And as we saw in the previous panel, there's this very nice framework that we globally have agreed on in terms of the SDGs on what do we consider as a global community important for us. And so you can say, how is everything that we're doing affecting some of those outcomes? The second is, at what price? Price is always there. And price, as we study in strategy, is not about your cost. Me going to Cambodia is not a zero-cost opportunity. There's an opportunity cost. The opportunity cost is the same 3 days I could have spent doing something else, perhaps contributing to the society in some other way. Unless I can justify that that's being achieved, there's a little bit of a question mark on the choice. And the third, of course, in this case, is the unintended consequences of the broken bones. So it's always important to bear that in mind. So thinking strategically about impact means, from my point of view, yes, it's fantastic to start from a position of I care, right? Because people that start from that position is genuine, is authentic, you can do a lot more. But we want to combine that with thinking a little bit like Mr. Spock, right? All the things that we do when we do business, we collect data, we understand the need, we work towards a solution, we iterate, we measure, we see are the outcomes being realized. All of that needs to be done. Simply because you're running a CSR project where you have $1 million to blow away doesn't mean you just give up on all of that. Yep. So, here's a sort of very simple way of thinking about how do you have impact. You do need to consider the same 3 things you would as a business normally. When we are running a business, we say, what's our mission? What's our vision and so on? What is the need out there for the customers? And what is my strength, resources, capabilities, competitive advantage? All of that needs to be applied, but now you're applying it at the level of the individual. And your sweet spot is really figuring out how do those three things overlap? Now, it's not easy, but at least this is worth thinking about. You ask yourself maybe once a year, I'm having an impact. Is it aligned with, I mean, is this really the best I could be doing? Can I be looking at more important issues? Can I be bringing more of my skills in? Is it really aligned with my passions and my constraints, by the way? Because what you can achieve depends on the context in which you're in. If you're in a large company, the kind of impact you can achieve is very different, right? You might change the world this much while being in Walmart, but if you change the world on a per unit basis this much, you probably will achieve far more in your life than chances are the average person could by opening a nonprofit. At the same time, if your passion is somewhere else, if you're like John Wood, you really are done with corporate life, yeah, you'll find some ways to make a difference. And John Wood was pleasantly surprised that a lot of the skills he thought would be irrelevant in the nonprofit sector ended up being actually very relevant. And as he built up and scaled Room to Read into one of the leading and most effective organizations in this space, right? So I'm going to, I have a few themes that I want to cover in the impact arena. And what I'll do is, by the way, I have about 420 slides because I'm teaching these courses, over 21 hours in Fontainebleau. And, it was just a matter of in which order I put those 420, and I figured when I run out of time, I'll stop. That's usually how I do it. But we'll see. So I do want to cover one theme, and then what we'll do is I love to pause and just get just reactions from the floor. So give me 5-10 minutes to run through this first one, because this directly builds on comments that have already been made this morning and yesterday, and then depending on if there's time left at the end, I'll cover more. So the first point, again, it's an obvious point, is the world of impact and the world of business are not separate. At the same time, they are not perfectly overlapping, right? So it's about, it's a Venn diagram, there's an overlap between the two. And once you start thinking intentionally about impact, you really are trying to find where in that overlapping space can I play if I'm going to play the game of business to have a positive impact. Now, for simplicity, at the risk of perhaps oversimplifying, I like to see the world of business as three vehicles when you think of the organizations through which you have an impact, right? One is sustainable business, the other is impact-driven business, the third is social enterprise. And I'm going to define it in a particular way because I find that useful. I'm not saying this is the final word, and you can choose to define these organizations differently. And as I acknowledge, there are certain organizations where it's not clear which side of the boundary you're in, but nevertheless, at least I find this useful. The first is sustainable business. To me, sustainable business typically is a large company, most of the times, public company, so you're responsible for shareholders, right? So yes, you can go around saying things perhaps like this, which is, we stop giving quarterly earnings guidance and doing quarterly reporting. We want people who want to build this company for the long term. I mean, that's fine. That seems reasonable. We are saying, yes, we care about shareholder value, but in the long run, right? And that's where a lot of this conversation is today. Perhaps it's really pushing the frontiers once you start saying the second thing, but maybe you can still say that. I tell shareholders that I'm not just working for them. Slavery was abolished a long time ago. Anybody know who made that statement a couple of years ago? So this was indeed Paul Polman from Unilever, and the Apple CEO Tim Cook made a similar statement. If the only thing that at Apple, the only thing we care about is not the bloody ROI, right? So these are pretty strong words for CEOs to use. So it's good news, CEOs really are pushing against a certain category of shareholders that are forcing them to think short term, and they're saying, no, we are going to think long term. And Unilever, of course, has set up this sustainable living plan, which started in 2010 and has been successful in many ways in saying, okay, we can grow the business at the same time as trying to make progress on issues like minimizing our environmental impact enhancing livelihoods, for example, by including smallholder farmers, having more gender inclusion in the value chains, bringing important products like soaps that save lives simply from the act of washing hands, because in some villages they don't even have their first soap, and educating kids there about the benefit of that, while at the same time actually expanding your business. It's great to the extent that you can do that, but of course there are some inherent tensions in there. For a brand you might have at Unilever, Dove is like, oh, fantastic brand. We are on the one hand promoting values like natural beauty is great, everybody, you're beautiful the way you are. At the same time, you have another brand which is Fair and Lovely, right? And the product positioning of that brand, which is very common in emerging markets and one of very high margin brands, is basically, unless you apply this on your screen and become a little bit fairer, you won't find a boyfriend and you won't find a job, right? So, and is Unilever going to get rid of that brand? Probably not. At the same time, over time, they become much more responsible in how it was being marketed. So what I said just now had been the very aggressive marketing, literally, for it until 10 years ago. Now it has become much more subtle. On the environmental dimension, their ambition was to cut down the environmental impact on a per unit basis in a 10-year time horizon by 50%, at the same time as increasing their growth to double the size of their business in a 10-year time horizon. It turns out the environmental targets are pretty hard to meet. So they moved them from 2020 to 2030 without growing the business targets. Now these are very real tensions, and Unilever, by the way, is best in class. It has won sustainability awards of all kinds, but there's only so much that companies, and in particular public companies, would be able to do. But it's great that leaders like Paul Polman, who obviously stepped out a few months ago, had really been pushing the frontiers. At the same time, even a company like Unilever had become a takeover threat, and Kraft had made a bid over it for a year ago, reflecting exactly the kind of pressures you face when you are inside a public company and juggling these different things. Now, the other category which inspires me a lot is this notion of impact-driven business, right? So impact-driven business, before I go there. So here's an apparel company that on Black Friday in the US, so Black Friday is, Thanksgiving weekend when most of the sales happen for a lot of companies and a lot of money gets made. Since 2011, it almost has a tradition pretty much every year, and this is what they did in 2011. They basically put a full-page newspaper ad, New York Times, don't buy this jacket. And then they have a lot of description for, this is our jacket. It's a great jacket, but really, it has so much wastage, so much carbon footprint, so much water being used in making it. So unless you really need it, that's the footprint, right? The fine print, which is unless you really need it, don't buy it. And by the way, our products are super high quality. That's why if you're going to buy it, it makes sense to buy this one, because you'll have to buy this jacket, and then for the next 10 years, you don't have to buy any other jacket, right? So they're trying to have a messaging that's consistent with them having a competitive advantage over, let's say, fast fashion of the world, while also at the same time being good for the environment. Anybody know the company? Yeah, it is indeed Patagonia. And, so many MBA students reach out to me saying, hey, somebody at Patagonia, I want a job there. So, well, it's not that easy, because without even trying, for every job, they get 500 applications, because that's the kind of energy it generates among people that read about it. And Yvonne Chenard is the founder, and then a few years ago, he brought a new CEO, Rose Marcario, and basically, she was disillusioned with corporate life. She was a hardcore finance person, and she was going to quit, and at least in one of the articles, I read her interview, she was seriously considering becoming a Buddhist nun. And then she ran into Yvonne, and she was so inspired, and then she became the CEO. And now she's basically an activist. That's what she is, and using Patagonia as a vehicle. But the customers are going along with Patagonia on this journey, because that's the positioning for the customers. That's what they expect from Patagonia. And they recently changed their mission statement, which used to be a pretty long one, to a one-liner. We are in the business of saving our home planet. That's literally their mission statement, and they have taken Trump head on in recent years on that. Now, so this to me is a category which is placing values first. The reason they are doing something does not have to be justified by shareholder value. Fortunately, in this case, because it's just privately owned, and this is where, connecting back to the talk from the morning, sometimes when a company is privately owned, or at least certainly privately controlled, there's a lot more things that the company can do. And so there's no reason for them to say, hey, our finance textbook says do this, so I have to do this. Well, why? And there's this option. And by the way, being able to think long-term in the end works out okay for these guys, even for competitive advantage, right? So the third category I want to acknowledge and make sure that we don't underplay is what I'm going to call social enterprise. So social enterprise is somebody who says, I think business is still the right way of serving this beneficiary group rather than just giving them money, right? Because maybe I'm giving them dignity, maybe I'm giving them choice. It allows me to bring the right products to them. But really, if I was going there with a hardcore profit-making organization, I will not be able to go with the kind of price points which make sense for this market. So maybe I will always be subsidized. Maybe I'll barely break even. But that's okay because I'm generating impact that others believe in. So an example of this is an organization we've worked with, Proximity Designs in Myanmar. It has a staff of 800. It's one of the biggest social enterprises in Myanmar. They've been there for 30, 40 years through thick and thin. And one of their most well-known products are irrigation products they've developed through design thinking, through collaboration with Stanford Design School and IDEO. I mean, they're not like a bunch of random people trying out random things. This is a very professionally run organization, run with all the discipline of a business, except it is subsidized through grant funding, and they get huge grant funding because they are able to show how much they change the lives of these farmers by helping them and guiding them through the farming process, through the right products, through services, and so on. Right? So these three categories are important to bear in mind. These are just different vehicles. I don't think of this one as being superior to the other. These are different vehicles, each of which has their own strengths, each of which has its own constraints. Sustainable business, impact-driven business, and social enterprise. The last thing I want to acknowledge is, sometimes, and this was a question somebody from the audience had asked yesterday, that, hey, it's fine, the sustainable story is great, do I need to wait till I become CEO before I actually do something about it, which is a fair question. So there's this movement almost starting, which people are calling social entrepreneurship. And a poster child for that is a man by the name Gib Bullock from Accenture, who it's a very interesting and very honest book that he wrote about consulting. And I'm amazed that he has not been sued yet with the kind of dirt that he puts on Accenture boardroom drama and senior management drama in this book that just came out last year. But about 10, 15 years ago, he narrates his story over the past 10 years until he quit Accenture a couple of years ago, about how he built a business, which is called Accenture Development Partnerships, which is about saying, hey, historically Accenture was only doing consulting projects for Fortune 500 companies. Can we do consulting for a development sector? We are not going to go do it pro bono like a lot of our competitors, because if you do it pro bono, the problem is there will only be so much you can do. At some point, the money runs out. We are going to do it on a break-even basis. And okay, so break-even is fine. It becomes perhaps more scalable. You still need a value proposition for the senior management. What's this value proposition for the leadership team? That there's huge benefits on the employee side. So we've done some research with them showing huge retention benefits from this, and huge employee engagement benefits, because there's a lot of people who are disillusioned as consultants after a few years in a consulting firm. They would have left anyway. They would have been happy to take a year of sabbatical or something, and here they are still growing through the ranks, and they can say, I'm doing 2 quote-unquote normal projects and one of these cool projects, if I can get in, because it turns out there's a huge waiting list for these projects. and I get to make the kind of difference I want. And in the process, I'm willing to even take a 50% salary cut because that's what they require. The only way they are able to make these projects financially viable is saying, just for the duration of those projects, your tenure at the company continues to count, but for that period, you will get 50% of what you normally get paid. You can't stay in five-star hotels and you can't fly business class. And the numbers sort of add up. So obviously, this is still work in progress, but that also shows how hard this is. But in principle, examples like these also are inspiring in terms of things that can be done. Okay, so just to preview, and this is to give a one-line summary of the next point, and I'm going to stop because I don't want to just keep on flashing more PowerPoints at you. One of the points that we spend a lot of time on in my classes is saying we think a lot about companies having business models, but we really need to start thinking in terms of having impact models as well. Because we take it for granted that just because our product is selling more, we are having more impact. Sometimes that's not true, and there's lots of case studies for that, which I can also share. Because as business, what you normally track is what is called outputs, which is how many people show up at your door, how many products are bought. You do not care and track what happens to the lives of people after that. Unlike in the development space, where you don't stop just at how many people showed up in a program I was running, you actually care about what happened in their lives. Did my programs actually make a meaningful difference? And this is becoming a very serious segment even within business, which is having an impact model, but then actually starting to follow up, measure, and see if the impact that you claim to be happening is actually happening. Because if it's not happening, you should not make claims. Because somebody else will do an academic research study on it and then tell the world that the impact you were claiming is not happening. Actually, let me just jump forward, and there is exactly an example of that, Tom Shoes. Right, so Tom Shoes, how many of you know Tom's? Fantastic company, millions of people love it. What's wrong with the idea of you buy a pair of shoes and a pair of shoes is given to some kid in need? They've come under a pretty strong heat from the development community saying, well, that's actually not as simple as that. And Bill Easterly is one of the top development economists. He's at New York University. And they're saying, hang on, you're making the same mistake that the development space made for years and years and years, imposing your solutions on what you think is right for a community, just assuming that there are these poor kids out there, millions of them, who need shoes. And once you dump shoes there, rather than helping build, let's say, an ecosystem around the shoe industry, which, by the way, you might be killing in some of those countries, because suddenly when somebody's getting free shoes, are they really going to buy the cheap, locally made shoes, even though they would have been fine? And the answer is no, right? So that's a very real dilemma that people are struggling with in this space. And Tom's Shoes itself has acknowledged, and by the way, as you might know, it's not called Tom's Shoes anymore. It's called Tom's for exactly that reason, which is Blake Mycoskie, the founder, moved to diversify into other product lines. He says, there's a lot of people that still want to do shoes. That's the story that sells. But if you read his own press releases and so on, he's admitting that shoes were not having the impact on people's lives that he was once imagining. That's why he's moving into other product lines, and where he's working a lot more, rather than dumping shoes into communities, working with local partners and investing in programs that actually help people's lives in a meaningful way, generate local jobs or meet more critical needs, let's say water and so on. The problem, of course, with that is that's where the tensions start to show, which is no longer this clean story of buy one pair of shoes and you imagine this poor kid somewhere, lives completely transformed because they are wearing your shoes. Now the story is a little bit like, can you buy a bag of coffee from us, and that will help us invest in a nonprofit that's running a water program somewhere, right? It's a harder marketing sell, even if it has a positive impact sell. So the original thing that doing well by doing good, yeah, it seems great, but once you start digging into the quote-unquote impact model, it was not doing that great. The entrepreneur decided, I'm going to look into my impact model, improve that impact, and go there, right? So I'll sort of close with this last slide. When we talk about impact model, I really have cooked up my own jargon for what the development space people have known for a long time. They call it theory of change or log frame, logical model. I mean, these are terms that the development space uses. I just like using impact model as a twin of business model. And what they're saying is, are you really sure there's a problem out there? Did anybody go do the needs analysis? Did anybody go ask these people on what their requirements are? And then did you really follow up not just with what we normally would do as a business, which is here's the resources, here's the activities, and this is the output, but did you go further and ask what are the outcomes being achieved? And most importantly, what would have happened otherwise? Because that's what your impact is. So I'll stop here and we can have some questions. Thank you. Anyone, yeah? Is there some, oh, that's a nice box.
Thank you very much, Sasha Nick from Lausanne. The question of impact in sustainability is interesting because it is not so much the relative impact. We replace product A by a slightly better product B, but the aggregate impact of all of the products, not just one company, but everything a person or a population is buying that makes sense.
Yeah.
So the aggregate impact on climate, energy, biodiversity, etc. How do you assess that impact?
This is a great question. I mean, impact evaluation is an entire field in itself in the development space, and people are bringing it more and more into this space. So one example, and it applies more to the social projects than climate, is what are called randomized controlled trials. That's a gold standard. Just like the way you do pharma testing, drug testing is you just say, here's a population of patients that got our drugs, and here's another population that didn't get our drugs but is otherwise similar. Ideally, randomly selected or at least closely matched. You track them for a few years, a few months, and so on, and did their lives improve? And people do that. So Vision Spring is a social enterprise. And they collaborated with some academics to do one of these studies around. So the Vision Spring, what they wanted to do was they say, okay, we have a business model through which we make affordable eyeglasses available to poor people, but we are going after the poorest segments at a price point where we can't make money. So we have a subsidized model, so we do need some donor funding. But we want to be able to tell a story. For every dollar that you give us, we will increase somebody's income. I'm forgetting what the number is in their case, but let's say $5, right? How do you show that? Because they take that data from a randomized study, a controlled trial, which somebody had done, and one of the most recent one was done in Assam, where Darjeeling tea comes from. And with tea pickers, they said, in a random population, we will make these eyeglasses available, because it turns out that the workers are paid based on their productivity at picking leaves. Tea leaves when they are ripe. And they showed that their productivity goes up by 20, 30%, and they're paid basically on volume. And by the way, normally once you cross 50 years, you're fired, because if you don't have glasses, you won't be able to pick enough tea leaves. And so there are studies like this, which they add together, and then if you go on their website today, that study is the first thing that's highlighted. And this is for every dollar that we do, this is what we do. Now, what does it mean for companies? Contrast Tom's with Warby Parker. How many of you know Warby Parker? So this is a eyeglasses, buy one, get one company, which, at the surface looks very similar to Tom's. There's two differences. The first is one of the founders, this is a bunch of Wharton MBAs who formed it around the same time, or maybe a little later, 2010 or something. Their starting point was one of the guys, or at least one of the founders, was from the development space. In fact, was working at Vision Spring, and so the person knew that the way to have impact much more, rather than dumping eyeglasses, is to bring eyeglasses at a very low price points to these communities by investing in entrepreneurs, because the leverage is much more. It's a little bit of the same story. Teach a person to fish versus giving fish. Giving glasses like giving fish. Teaching the local community how they can build a business around selling eyeglasses is teaching them how to fish, except that it is still being done by the social enterprise. Now, Warby Parker says, because these guys have a credible impact, rather than me doing a buy one, get one in the form of I'm giving eyeglasses, I'm going to give the money that's coming in, selling to the customers in the US with this value proposition to the social enterprise because it can transparently tell me for every dollar that I give, what is the impact. Now, this is just an illustration. Obviously, it's a super hard problem, but this is a field in itself, and there are like 1 week programs, 2 weeks programs, literally on just impact evaluation that one can go to learn more. Development economics is an area in which this is perhaps most developed as a topic. Yes, sir.
I have the thing already. I'll pass it over. Sorry. Sorry.
It will come back. We have time, I think.
Good morning, everyone. Radoslav, MBA 2012. I have the following question, and I'm very happy that you touched on Patagonia. My question is, to what extent do you think that large corporations, businesses, should be changing on purpose consumer behavior in order to bring all of us to a more sustainable future? Just shortly in context, think about, for example, Burger King. Meat-based burgers, we all know what is the impact of meat-producing industry. So to what extent Burger King should be changing their products in order to shape consumer behaviors?
I would go further than should. Actually, lots of companies already are, right? So credit to Unilever. One of the reasons why they had to push their target to 2030 instead of 2020 was they were saying, we are going to hold ourselves responsible, not just for the carbon footprint in our part of the supply chain, but we are going to hold ourselves responsible in the entire value chain. So they invest a lot, let's say when somebody uses one of their new laundry detergents, right, or fabric softeners, which needs less water, they are actually saying, okay, we are going to first of all invest in those products, and second, we are going to go to the customer and actually educate them. Now, in fact, that's exactly what has been the challenge for Unilever. Unilever has been fantastic in reducing wastage, carbon footprint, and all of that in water usage in their own supply chain. Where they failed spectacularly, just like most other companies, is actually changing our behavior. Because it turns out people are okay, my behavior, maybe not your behavior.
I didn't understand what you said.
So let's say Unilever comes up with a new detergent which cleans as well, if not better, even if you run your washing machine at a short cycle rather than a long cycle. But you're paranoid, I have a little kid, I want to make sure the clothing is clean and there's no residue left on my clothes. So as a consumer, it turns out the consumers are very resistant to just believing Unilever that this new product, actually if you put it in a short cycle for 1 hour, it's going to clean as well as the long cycle in the previous. So I would still run it on the 3-hour cycle. What that means is a lot more water being used. So Unilever in their reports will say, we failed to achieve our targets, not because our factories couldn't reduce the water usage, but we couldn't reduce the consumers. So I completely agree. Companies not only should, they are already trying to, at least certainly the ones on the frontier, but it's turning out to be tough. Having said that, it also, it's the usual constraint that others have been talking about. Would you really push it to a point where you feel there will be, the shareholders will come and, Kraft will come and sort of take over Unilever? There's only so much that Unilever can do. So I'm a little bit realistic on that. That's where I think the conversation we were having about corporate governance reforms, which people are trying out, for example, new legal forms for companies, that those things are tried out. I think it will take time, but I think it's headed. Like certified B Corps, there's about 3,000 of those. There's some very serious questions about entities like certified B Corps, which is a more privately certified, or in the US context, benefit corporations. And I think UK and Italy has similar new legal forms for rather than the traditional for-profit companies, where as a mission statement, you can put purpose in your corporate governance charter. And in principle, now you can be sued for fiduciary duty if the only thing you're doing is focusing on shareholder values. That's the theory. In practice, it's still work in progress because that's tricky. Please, sir.
Do you have to press it or just speak?
I think just speak.
Sven Cardo, I have a very simple question and wonder if one of your 420 slides pertains to that. If I, as an old-timer, decided I'm not going to leave money to my children, but rather plant a big forest. It's not a business, of course, but it's good for the world, and maybe in 30 years they can cut it down and use it. Have you got a slide on that subject, or if
It's
not,
not,
what is
and
your answer?
but you know, carbon offset is something that a lot of organizations, if I understand, are offering, and maybe somebody in the room can offer that. But I do have this funny anecdote that I was teaching once in an executive program for the Swire Group, which, among other organizations, has Cathay Pacific as one of their companies, right? So somebody at Cathay was saying, well, we have a lot of this, you know, we obviously as airline have a lot of carbon footprint, and we are going to solve that problem, not by planting forests, but by buying some forest in Amazon. And I said, well, think from the society's point of view. It's great. You just changed ownership. But if the total number of trees in the world have not increased, how have you made up for the carbon that you generated? And this is the question of impact, right? Imagine the world with you and the world without your involvement in terms of your project. In this case, the project is not about planting more trees, but simply me buying trees from somewhere else, so that, by the way, in my balance sheet, it looks wonderful. Because Cathay Pacific suddenly will look carbon neutral because they now own a certain amount of trees that are releasing oxygen into the air and capturing carbon dioxide. But as a society, the carbon emissions are real, and the carbon savior is sort of an accounting trick, really. So it's these kind of questions. And this is what I mean by the unintended consequences and the big picture, keeping that in mind. You might have, from the point of view of reporting, made yourself a carbon neutral company. Have you improved the world? It's not obvious to me.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
So thank you for the presentation, John Soljanikov, based here in Geneva. A lot of what you were telling us about is around how business can have a greater impact on society. There's a little less, I think, on the how can business reduce its negative impact. You did touch at the beginning, and as you mentioned, there are some criticisms. I'm curious about if that's part of the dialogue at all, and specifically around tax. Maybe you've seen the video from Davos this year that went quite viral around the historian telling billionaires to just pay more tax. Do you think that's part of the dialogue, or what's your view on that whole?
So, I mean, here I completely agree with the Winners Take All book that I acknowledge, right? There's certain things that the government should be doing, and we should not come in the way of it. And I think his point is exactly that companies should at a minimum not be trying to aggressively lobby to reduce it and all of that. But in the end, I mean, it goes back to the same pressures that everybody was talking about, right? So this is a societal issue, and I mean, I personally view that, you know, there's limits to how much companies would do, which is exactly why we can't leave it all to companies. At the same time, you know, we have to keep on making progress. And by the way, the story all around ESG metrics, for example, right? Environmental, social, and governance metrics. And, you know, we had the BlackRock, head of BlackRock, Larry Fink, last year sending a letter to basically all Fortune 500s saying, yeah, financial returns are fine. You know, I would like to see you clean up your act on the environment and social metrics. Now, this is BlackRock, right? There's like $3, $4, or $5 trillion of assets under management going through them. And they are sending letters to CEOs, hey, guys, can you clean up a sense on, you know, do you have a sense of purpose? Are you actually caring about the planet? And all of that. And, you know, to him, it's not a touchy-feely story. In part, the story is about, like, you know, Tijan was talking about yesterday, it's about reputation very often is the biggest asset for these companies, which is, this is a goodwill building exercise, because if something blows up tomorrow, because for every company, every year, something will blow up, somebody will give you the benefit of doubt. Hey, you're the good guys. You were trying to do the right thing. You know, you just happened to, have an oil spill, versus we knew these guys are the crooks anyway, and they are so negligent, and look, now they have the oil spill. And the cost of the same event to the company would be very different. So that's how the argument usually gets made from the shareholder value point of view, I think. And you know, that's sort of what can be done, but I certainly the government angle, and we see all the debate about Facebook. And I just read Facebook has been dropped out of the S&P whatever sustainability index, partly because of low scores on the social and particularly governance metrics. It just got dropped out of the index. To the extent that that matters to them, I don't know. But there are real implications, real costs. If you think that's a cost to your company, then there are real costs now of you not cleaning up your act. Yeah, sure.
Yep.
Yes, please.
About social impact within the fairly classical business model. But now we have two new phenomena, I think, in the industrialized world, which is, we have a new wave of automation, and in the knowledge economy, wealth and income are becoming more and more concentrated in fewer individuals. And so I'm curious to know, what do you think that could change in business models to distribute the wealth that we're creating collectively when jobs and salaries perhaps will not be performing that role so well anymore?
It's a great question. I don't have any magic answers to that beyond what I said here, which is if you're just seen as the bad guys that are accentuating the societal problems, usually it's a risk. And to some extent, that's why I think it's the role of government and policy, even though we see policymakers as these slow-moving entities and the government as something that's irrelevant and taxes as something bad, right? So people talk about, hey, it's fine to have lean-in and women helping each other. What about actually having, at the societal level, a little bit more generous family leave, or a little bit better schooling, so that couples are both able to work? And so I think a lot of this dialogue really is a societal level dialogue. Businesses can do their thing, but I'm also skeptic about when people start to depend too much on how much will business fix. Same thing, tax rates. It takes cuts. So looks like my time is up. 1 hour just flew past. So okay, so time just came back on. We can see the power hierarchy here a little bit, perhaps. I will let people decide. He has the box, he says.
Hello?
He's the man with the box.
Yes, okay. Hello?
Maybe we can take both questions together very quickly, and I'll take them. Just very fast. Let's.
Very fast. Business school in Fontainebleau taught me in 1979, profit is something to do with costs and sales and thus. I think you said something inspirational just now, relative to impact. What you actually did was put up a beautiful process that finished up with outcomes. Okay, what would have happened everywhere? And you told us a story about the Assam tea. And you define the outcome in terms of added value. You actually measure the value through your process. What value was there before, what value was there afterwards? And every case study I've heard you talk about this morning and others, it turns out we're measuring not profit conventionally, but added value. Yeah. So I'm just asking you the general question, is that true?
No, I think that's right, because I used, as I said, when I was a newbie assistant professor in 2004, I got this nice slide deck from Peter Zemsky on, added value is equal to the world with you minus the world without you, and I changed the word impact there, so that's exactly right. The important thing is the added value from the point of view of you're making sure you're considering adding added value society-wise, because very often we just focus on, hey, it's you and me doing the transaction. So first, let's figure out what is the size of the pie just between the two of us, and then second step, we will split the pie. It's like now we're saying, hey, hang on, the pie is much bigger, and you might be eating somebody else's pie, so let's take that into account. So it's added value, but added value really at the societal level and not just bilateral level. There was a very quick one, yes?
Yes. Hello. As an old dinosaur of INSEAD, I just want to ask you to define the impact has become quite a problem these days. Look, everybody's rushing on electric cars and saying how it's wonderful for the environment, etc. And now we are discovering the dangers of electric cars, the production of batteries, taking the lithium in China or in, somewhere in South America. And what are we going to do with the batteries, the scrap batteries, etc., etc. Killing jobs in the mechanics because there's no more mechanics, it's only electric engine. So I think the studying of an impact is even more difficult to do nowadays
sure.
than it was before, and we need at INSEAD someone to teach us how to study impact.
I agree. So 30 seconds. So the only thing that I want to say in response to that is actually myself. I mean, to be honest, I came in this space thinking I'm a business school professor, I'm so smart, and which, by the way, is exactly what happens when our MBAs go to social enterprises, and within a day, they have a solution to a problem that they've been working on for 10 years. I've come to believe that in this space, the number one skill is humility. And recognizing, because essentially what you're doing is, the Adam Smith invisible hand, the beauty to that, if it worked, was you didn't have to worry about things. The minute you start messing with things, there is going to be so many unintended consequences. So either you go in with the humility that I'm going to try my best to track all of my consequences and do something about it. But if you're not committed to that, we should not go in trying to do Band-Aid on something and make this worse. And I'll stop there. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.